not an implementation of this or that. Thank you. And I'll now hand it over to Untitled.
Welcome Dr. Suresh to the panel. I'm really happy we have you. And just wanted to help set the context on what is us on the supply chain and how does India feature as a robust supply chain for the global exports.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the U.S. Embassy in India for inviting me to share my thoughts on this very important subject. I'd also like to thank all the eminent professionals who are attending this session today, both virtually and in person. Thank you for that question, Anjali. In order to provide a broader context for this very important topic, I thought I'd first run through 5 or 6 PowerPoint slides, and I'd like to, the first one be displayed. First PowerPoint slide. That's right. So in this slide, what I'm trying to show quickly is the world is changing rapidly. The center of gravity of the world economic activity is shifting to and yet, as you can see, India is number 3. With China being number 1, USA being number 2, and India being third, but it's still way out in the rankings. But on the right side, we have GDP adjusted per capita GDP. That's slightly lower than many numbers here. You can see 3 times than China. So India has a lot of catch up to do as well, in spite of the remarkable progress. And so let's go to the next slide, which will show the most exporting nations of the world, which, as you can see, China and US way at the top, while China with 2.1 trillion export prowess, and all the way down, number 20 is India, with currently almost 300 billion is export for India the year 2022. And in this picture, you will see some peculiar situations as well. For instance, if you look at number 13, Singapore, Singapore's exports total is 372 billion. But if you look at the population of Singapore, it's only about 5.8 million. That is, we're talking about a population of 1/3, less than 1/3 that of Mumbai. And so, in spite of such a small size, Singapore's export prowess is phenomenal. It's all due to the free markets, liberal, business-friendly policies of the government. And this goes to show how far we can go, India can go. And India has set a very ambitious goal for this year, and it appears to be well on track to achieving that. And likewise, in the next slide, we'll see the rankings of the most important nations of the world. India is now number 9 on the list. That means India imports a lot more, about 178 billion more than exports, though there is a deficit moment. So let's go to the next slide. This next slide shows some major trade interactions between various countries of the world. China and the US. China exports 4 billion. The US exports 103 billion. So that's you can see the asymmetry between the US and China trade. So if you look at the Pacific Ocean, all the ships coming towards the US west coast carrying China's goods go back only half, or as in logistics language, the backhaul is much poor, as we say in logistics terminology. But that is the most important and significant trade interaction between 2 countries. And likewise, you can see the very heavy interaction between China, Korea, and Japan on the right-hand side. The numbers are very big. But you can see India's share between China, for instance, you can see 68 and 17. That means India imports 4 times more than what it exports to China. And likewise, India's interaction with the USA is very significant, 54 billion and 35. But the picture very clearly shows that there's much great potential for India to scale up its numbers, export numbers, and it can only come through scaling up its manufacturing sector. And going to the next slide. This is on the left-hand side, we take a quick look at India's profile of exports. And most of the India's exports are consumer goods, 45%, intermediate goods, capital goods, and so on. And on the right-hand side, India's import profiles, most of the products, nearly 1/3 of its imports are raw materials. And at the final slide, I thought I would show the FDI numbers, foreign direct investment numbers, which is an indicator which is reflective of the growth potential of a country, both in manufacturing and services. And as you can see, India's FDI has been increasing significantly. But you can see it's still only 1/3 that of China, so we still have a lot of scope for improvement on this end. So with that as the background, I thought we could just get what are some things that could be done
on exports, but ninth on the import side, and so we have a good runway when it comes to increasing exports in front of us. So my first question, and this is a bit of a conversation between Dr. Suresh and us here, and so invite the audience as well. So we are at India, this is a consumption-based economy where it's only service sector which is at play, followed by industrial and ag. As you can see, data, there's opportunity. In your view, what should we be doing differently at a country level to grow exports in comparison to other countries that have been successful? You took the example of Singapore, China, country of the world, right? So what should we be doing differently when a lot of things going for India? It's a younger population, please appreciate, so competitiveness wise we are there. There's a target of $400 billion, right? So what should we be doing differently to accomplish the goal?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what exactly should we be doing? The thing is, if we want to scale up our exports, obviously we should be producing more. In other words, our manufacturing output has to increase. And let's see, there are dozens and dozens of things that we should be doing in order to scale up our manufacturing output and thereby increase our export performance as well. And I thought we could categorize them into 2 broad categories. Now, nationally, it is clear that we need to stimulate manufacturing, and we should do everything in our power to scale up our manufacturing output. And we should stimulate manufacturing entrepreneurship. We must just as Mr. Ticknow rightly pointed out, we are an over-regulated nation, and manufacturing particularly is really stifled because of all the bureaucracy, what we call a permit license quota large in this country. And the MSME sector particularly, there's a lot of potential for scaling up the output of the MSME sector. After all, the MSME sector is the heart and soul of a nation. Most of the people are working in the MSME sector, and the MSME sector's contribution to the GDP is not a mean number by any means. I think it's about 45% as such. And so nationally, there are lots of things to be done to stimulate manufacturing and scale up manufacturing. At the same time, we are faced with lots of problems that is more easily said than done. We need to dismantle lots of things like factories. What are the deterrents in manufacturing entrepreneurship? We have Factories Act, we have all kinds of labor laws, we have very difficult bureaucratic hurdles which prevent manufacturing entrepreneurship to take root. And so the other possibility is to use the special economic zone as a catalyst to stimulate manufacturing. In fact, so I would say basically, broadly speaking, there is a dual strategy that we need to be following. In fact, we have started following. One is on the nationally try and stimulate manufacturing and scale up production, and alongside that, use the special economic zones as a catalyst to stimulate manufacturing. Now, if we look all around India, some of this, we have shining examples all around us, starting with Taiwan, starting with Korea, and of course China. All these countries have shown us how adopting this special economic zone strategy has successfully, those countries have scaled up their manufacturing. In fact, there is no choice but to actually emulate that. We need to systematically study how they used these export processing zones and later the special economic zones to stimulate manufacturing activity. The reason being, within this SEZs or special economic zones, we are not encumbered by all the bureaucracy that we face nationally. Within the SEZ, we have a lot more latitude, we have more freedom, we can get around a lot of legal obstacles and so on. So that is exactly how China, that is exactly how Taiwan, that's exactly how Korea scaled up its manufacturing. And I don't know if I can take a few minutes to quickly go through how individually these three countries scaled up their manufacturing through the SCZ strategy. Of course, you've asked a very, very big question and can't need at least a few more minutes on this one. Okay. Now, I don't know, back in the 1980s, made in Japan was the kind of a benchmark for quality manufacturing. Now, after some time, the manufacturing costs, the labor costs in Japan started increasing. And so the Japanese manufacturers had to find other ways to manufacture. So they started approaching Taiwan and Korea, which are adjacent to Japan, to start producing in those countries. Now the Taiwanese and Koreans were initially a bit reluctant to accept Japanese investment. You know, the memory of World War II were very fresh in their minds. The Koreans particularly were. The Taiwanese were a little more welcoming for Japanese FDR. So what started was, in Taiwan for instance, they started assembling products for Japanese manufacturing companies. Japan and Taiwan particularly started setting up export promotion zones, the EPZs we call them, EPZ, sorry for the pronunciation, EPZ I should say, or EPC. And likewise, Korea also started using export promotion zones. These are exclusive demarcated areas of the country where you can operate with great freedom and you can completely pursue export-oriented strategies. And of course, both these countries follow two strategies. One is ISI strategy, that is import substitution-driven industrialization. Of course, this ISI is nothing. And some other sectors, they use export orientation as the dominant strategy. At any rate, these export promotion zones were the catalyst for scaling up manufacturing. Now, the Koreans were a little more wary of Japanese capital, and what they did was, in all the joint venture contracts, they made sure that the technology transfer took place into Korean companies. And they also insisted that Korean companies had to learn how to market their products globally. The Japanese are operating through the Export Trading Corporation, the EDC. The Japanese continue to be the world leaders in export trading corporations. And through that mechanism, the Koreans learned international marketing strategies. So the net result is the Korean industries, we have big names like Samsung, LG, which are known all over the world. The Koreans not only became good manufacturers, they were also good international marketers. So likewise, the Taiwanese also really scaled up their manufacturing. They became great manufacturing powers. The electronics industry took root in both these countries and so on. Later, Chinese came into the picture. The Chinese took a look at the export promotion zones of Taiwan, and the Chinese brought in this scope. They call it special economic zones. And today we use the special economic zone as an umbrella term for many of these variants. And so the Chinese created SEZs all along the coast. And they also created the 14 coastal cities where foreign investments were freely permitted. And within these, starting with Shenzhen Special Economic Zone, the Chinese experimented with all kinds of different types of partnerships with foreign companies. And the net result was there was a lot of technology absorption. It really stimulated manufacturing within the. So looking at all these shining examples, in fact, more closer to home, we have the example of Bangladesh. Bangladesh has become the world's second largest exporter of textiles and second only to China. All this happened during the last 10 to 20 years. Bangladesh is another example to look at. So coming back to the point, India has to pursue a dual strategy. Within the country, it has to make everything easy for manufacturing, stimulate manufacturing activity. And side by side, it has to use the special economic zones as the catalyst for stimulating manufacturing, just like what the neighbors have done.
Great observation. This ease of doing business aspect, policy, and certainly SEZ has been a part of the India story as well. Right? So the government over the years has been pushing this manufacturing in India, made in India, right, for India as well as for the world. And this is an initiative where we are encouraging companies to develop, manufacture, assemble products in India, incentivize investments into manufacturing. Obviously, the scale has to go up, but there is some success that has been achieved in some segments, in some sectors, and certainly more to be done. So, in your view, as you study India, how do you see this, right? Which are the segments where you see there has been a lot of progress, and there are other segments where there is still more to be achieved in terms of staying competitive in the market? Like I can see over the years, China has shifted the mix of exports, right? And that's one of the reasons why also this increased exports. And traditionally, as you showed the mix of Indian exports, it's primarily remained the same. So there's certainly a space of actually doing more technology-driven exports out of the country to really scale up and achieve this targets that we're setting up, right? So, what are your thoughts?
Yes. First, Anjali, you mentioned ease of doing business. I would like to share one. Come to the other question, which is and now we have all the elements in place. We have many SECs all over the country now. Our infrastructure is really starting to pick up. It's really gaining momentum. Especially with the two western and eastern dedicated freight corridors coming in, they're going to be real game changers and so on. And so we have started to operating the SECs and so on. But one more thing I would like to add is not only have to set up these SECs, but we also have to start operating them just the way the Chinese and the Taiwanese and the Koreans do, particularly the Chinese do. In China, for example, I would like to share a personal example with you, if I may. And I've been going to China for the last 20, 25 years, year after year, and I've been amazed at the changes that take place year after year, and so on. About 10 or 12 years ago, for instance, I visited an Indian factory near Shanghai. This is one of the TVS group companies, Sundram Fasteners. And now they had set up this factory in a place called Jiaxing City, which is between Shanghai and Hangzhou. And I spent a day with them because I was in the area they hosted me. And I was asking them what are some of the reasons why you chose this particular location in China, etc. And they were saying, first of all, of course, the auto industry is centered around Shanghai, the Shanghai Auto Group, etc. Besides that, initially when they started quoting the party bosses, I believe they spoke to 18 different coastal regions, and this particular party boss was the most business friendly of them all. And there was a certain history behind it. They shared it in the story. Why exactly was this person so business friendly? Now this person was so enthusiastic And what he did, for instance, was he selected a good piece of land, and there was a particular road. It had a Chinese name. They changed the name of the road to Sundram Road, and they changed the numbering of the street to this became the number one Sundram Road. And any kind of problem they had with water, power issues, he was the single window, and that person would solve the problem with the different governmental agencies. Now, the single window concept is good, and in this case, it is one person serving as the single window. And they said it was so easy to do business, and they set up this factory within 10 months or so. And there was also the port connectivity. They were starting to export from this. They were planning to export out of this factory. The world's great port of Yangshan Deepwater Port, also the Ningbo Jiaoshan Port, both the ports were there, excellent highways, connectivity, etc. But coming back to the story about that person, well, apparently in China, every provincial boss has a target. So much FDI they have to bring in every year. And if you keep this person was missing his target for several years. And so he was sent to a re-education camp. He had to write a confession letter. And then he came back extremely aggressive, extremely fully chastised from this experience. That's exactly why he's so enthusiastic, and these people chose him, and so on. So what I'm going to say is, we can set up our special economic zones, etc. And as the results, the outcome of that is every FCC should produce so much exports. Every FCC should have the responsibility of bringing so much FDI, etc. And everybody in China, there's an interstate competition, inter-provincial competition, inter-city competition. And people who bring in more FDI are rewarded, and people who don't meet the targets are punished. And those are some things we cannot do in a democratic country. What I'm going to say is the accountability factor, incentivizing FDI, and operating the special economic zone in a much more result-oriented way. But those are something we need to do as well. So it's not enough if you just set up the SCCs. We also need to start operating them very proactively, like the Chinese do. And it's coming back to the point. And so you mentioned that India's performance across the different sectors. Now, India's got lots of things going for it. We have the low-cost advantage, of course. We have the low-cost advantage. We also have a highly skilled engineering talent in this country. Huge amount of engineering talent in this country. And we have a large entrepreneurial spirit in the country. In the case of manufacturing, that has been stifled, of course. Our infrastructure is pretty good. It's getting to be very good now, etc. And we also have this exchange rate differential that makes whatever is produced in India in terms of dollar, it becomes ridiculously cheap. The purchasing power parity aspect. So we have lots of things going for it, and we need to exploit all the strengths, and that it is definitely possible. So.
Great. Sure. Now coming back to what's going on around us, right? And there are some of the questions audience is also asking about supply chain disruption, the supply side vulnerabilities that we are in the recent times. Certainly the pandemic has played its role, and very recently the geopolitical issues also are not helping. Right? We continue to see commodity prices go up, these logistical challenges, port congestions, shortages. So how do you think about building a robust supply chain, right? Because if India has to be the export hub for the world and play a major role in Indo-Pacific, there's an expectation of reliability, dependability, right, on building robust supply chains. So how do you think we should cope certainly these uncertain times? And the challenge could be very different for a large-scale enterprise versus a medium-scale enterprise, right? Just the magnitude of the issue that is in front of us.
Yeah. Now, this is first of all, a very opportune moment for India, because every global value chain, a GVC, to use an economics acronym, every GVC right now in the process of diversifying, as Mr. Digno pointed out. because there are too much over dependencies on certain sector, etc. This is a great opportunity for India to scale up its manufacturing and realize its full potential in the manufacturing sector. And coming to supply chain disruption management, we are now developing very comprehensive disruption risk management procedures. It looks at all aspects of risk. Now, for instance, in a supply chain, first of all, we are going to have lots of supply side risks. Right now, the two big problems are the over-reliance on certain geographical regions, particularly China, the over-dependence on China. And China has also been feeling that there's over-dependence on its demand side. And China has been trying to diversify on its demand side, not to be over-reliant on the US, for instance, etc. So on the supply side, we have a lot of these over-dependencies and concentration of production in single companies and so forth. So if you look at the semiconductor supply chain, we have this one company in Taiwan, TSMC, which is producing 2/3 of all it's the world's largest contract chip manufacturer. 2/3 of all the chip manufacturing is done by TSMC. Now the problem is, in our supply chains, in our quest for low cost, we have been seeking economies of scale relentlessly. And so when we make certain production hubs larger and larger and larger, we try to get a lot of economies of scale, and that reduces the cost. But now we are realizing that we're putting all the eggs in one basket, and we are not trying to reduce the dependency on some major production hubs. And we're also trying to reduce geographical concentration of suppliers in certain regions. And likewise, we have a lot of supply side uncertainties. Coming from transportation bottlenecks on the supply side as well. For example, from a US point of view, there will be the congestion at the West Coast ports, the Los Angeles port, and the shortage of truck drivers, the shortage of containers, all kinds of constraints on the supply side. And in fact, even on the ports on the Chinese side, because of the COVID disruption. Right now, for example, the port of Shenzhen is going through a big disruption because of the Omicron wave that's going on in China in the last 1 or 2 weeks. And so there are a lot of supply side uncertainties. Likewise, we look systematically at the demand side uncertainties. On the demand side uncertainty, the demand volatility, a lot of panic buying, the shortage of toilet tissues and hand sanitizers, medical equipment, masks, all kinds of things. The demand volatility became great on the demand side. Volatility became great on the demand side. And exchange rate fluctuations, concentration of demand, being over-dependent on certain customers, etc. So you got a whole lot of demand side risk. And then we got a whole lot of internal risks within the supply chain. And then you got a lot of logistical risks in the supply chain. And then you have the whole supply chain is subject to a lot of natural disasters like earthquakes and tsunamis. For example, the case of Fukushima, a nuclear reactor, it was a combination of tsunami and an earthquake and a nuclear reactor failing. So you have a lot of environmental risks as well, which are very hard to predict. Now, so we are now developing very systematic supply chain disruption risk management procedures, which involves not only sensing but also responding. Now, there's a lot of mitigation tactics and also response tactics, and we try to anticipate as much as possible. Now, we may not be able to predict exactly the type of event that's going to happen, the next big event. It may be an asteroid hit, for all you know. But whatever the type of disruption we have, at the end of the day, it is going to entail in some supply nodes being failing, or some arms being failing, or the whole supply network failing. So even though we may not be able to predict the exact disruption event, the next disruption event, we can always predict the consequences of one node failing or several nodes failing, etc. We have to proceed on that basis. And so we are developing very systematic disruption risk management. We have an ISO standards 22301 in place now. And how do you use that ISO standard 22301? as a systematic procedure, the supply chain disruption, risk management, etc. So, and
so I think the point is developing diversified strategies, right, when it comes to mitigating supply side risks. And certainly there is a role in terms of building some of this locally as well, right, in terms of supply chain. Over-dependence on imports also impacts the India supply chain, right. So great pointers, Suresh. I want to now switch gears, and there's one of the questions in the audience as well on skilling needs, right? Certainly the pandemic has pushed the envelope on digitization, and India is, I would say, one of the leaders when it comes to embracing things faster, right? For example, e-payments and just the digitization rate is really rapidly spread now in India. So in terms of skilling needs, how do you see the cope up, right? Because there are two things that are happening. Certainly the supply side disruptions and cleaner technologies, need supply chain, all of that, and which calls for a shift in terms of how we operate, go about thinking on reskilling or building new skills, developing institutions.
now, it's a great question. It has huge human resource impact and potential. Now, if you look at the supply chain, we use a vast array of skills. Like on the manufacturing side of things, we need not only the traditional machine tool operators, we also need people who can operate CNC machine tools, and we need to equip them in part programming skills and so forth. So in terms of the manufacturing skill base, you see a lot of not only traditional machine tool technicians, but also programming skills as well, and so on. And in the logistics world, we have a great need, especially in the logistics, the trade, conducting the trade. For instance, in all of the international trade documentation, almost half the letter credits have some documentary error or the other, misspecification of input on, and not being able to understand the duties and tariffs procedure. Even simple things like what is the HS number, what is the correct HS number to apply, etc. So in the logistics space, there is a huge need for training good logistics professionals, not only good logistics managers, but also good logistics administrators who can actually conduct the space and so on. So likewise, if you look at every segment of the supply chain, likewise in the purchasing side of things, we need a new kind of procurement professional. Now traditionally, procurement professionals have to be good at identifying supply sources, negotiating with them well, making sure that the deliveries come on time, and getting all the R's right, all the incoming materials have to be in the right quantity, right quality, right cost, etc. But today's purchasing managers must also be very globally savvy, because nothing is easy to buy anymore. Because even commodity items, we have big consumers like China and India, of course, and nothing is easy to buy anymore. So in other words, purchasing professionals should be much more globally connected with the commodity markets throughout the world. The suppliers that are available are not only local, but there are suppliers coming from the other end of the planet. So we need, even the purchasing professionalism have changed. Likewise, we need new type of marketing people and so on. So talking about skilling, pretty much every segment of the supply chain, we need more future-oriented supply chain professionals at all the levels.
I want to get to the audience questions here, and some very interesting questions have been asked here. Certainly your commentary on PLI scheme, right, is highlighting that you think a scheme like PLI, which is this production-linked incentive, could make a shift in terms of how we think about technology, how we bring technology, how we introduce it in country, for the country as well as for the right. Your thoughts, right?
the production linked incentive scheme, which is India introduced last year, and now you have it is personally, I think, in my humble opinion, I think it's going to be a real game changer. Provided now you're giving all these huge incentives to selected players in 13 or 14 different sectors. It is very important also to make sure those companies deliver what they are expected to do in terms of developing new technologies like drone technology, green energy resources, and electrification projects, and also the social objectives of generating new employment, and of course scaling up production. That's the main objective, scaling up production to more than 500 billion over the next 5 years. That means, so in other words, the PLI scheme is wonderful, has huge potential, but much also depends on holding the companies accountable, making sure that the companies deliver what they were expected to deliver. And as long as that is guaranteed, personally, I think it's going to be a huge, great game changer. And I really think, personally, I'm very extremely optimistic about the program. The only caveat is it has to be the accountability on the part of the companies who are receiving the taxpayer money deliver all this what they were expected to do.
Report, Professor Suresh. Certainly, I mean, from my point of view, like the horizon to increase, it's only up to 2027. That's not enough time to invest and get the returns going, right? So that would be one aspect I would have. But yeah, so welcome initiative by the government of India.
That 2027 target, personally, I think I welcome that. It provides a sense of urgency, and it also gives you a certain, after all, companies cannot expect these taxpayer incentives forever. There has to be a certain horizon for that.
Sure. There's a question from the MSME. Say, okay, I think all of this is good in the large scale world, right? But when it comes to the MSME world, right, and we want to do more export, impacting, so how should we be approaching? Should the government be thinking about some relief, right? And for this sector.
So the MSME sector is a very, very important sector. It is the heart and soul of. In fact, the vast majority of people are in the MSME sector, and a big part of the MSME sector is the informal sector. Now, many of these companies are not even registered. They're operating in their own world. They don't pay taxes. And in fact, that is the enclave of true capitalism. These are the guys who are genuine entrepreneurs. They live from day to day. Except that the sector is so fragmented, this is really where free market is. These are the true capitalists of the country. Anyway, that is a very big sector. They actually contribute a huge amount of employment. They are actually the main sector as far as employment is concerned, and their contribution to GDP is also it's a very, very important sector. So even as we concentrate on the big companies by incentivizing them and PLIs, etc., we should also have very concrete strategy as far as the MSME is concerned. Now, if you look at the MSME, the average small company, the amount of hassles that they go through on a day-to-day basis, the obstacles that they face. Chinese small businesses. They're all connected globally. And so, uh, now the GPC-oriented strategy, global value chain-oriented strategy, development strategy, the special economic zones, all those things fall in the picture. The GPC-oriented strategy must also be carried over into the MSME sector. Well, because, for instance, a small businessman cannot be expected to provide finance. It's too risky for them. So what the Chinese did was, in all this partnership with the foreign companies are the ones providing capital, and the MSMEs provide the labor and those kinds of inputs and their skills and labor, and the foreign companies provide the technology and the capital. And that way, that's one way out of this whole big problem. Otherwise, you have this huge difference, the financing problem, the amount of risks that they have to take, etc. So you need to have a very systematic GVC-oriented strategy for the MSME sector. And again, we have shining examples. We can take a close look at what, for example, if you look at China, they're all clustered together. In India, we have clusters like Tirupattur, in Tamil Nadu, for example, we have Tirupattur, you have Erode, you have many Sivagasi for firecrackers and so on. In China, for instance, everybody knows this particular cluster called the GD cluster. Outside of Shanghai, you have the Jiangsu province. In the GD cluster, for example, there are 5,000 small businesses. All of them concentrate only on children's clothing. I might wonder, why should all the children's clothing companies compete with each other and all be located in one place? But if you look at the large value chain perspective, a lot of energy is in every aspect of the supply chain, including marketing. All these companies jointly come to a commodity city where they can all jointly market their products. And global companies find all their suppliers in one place. And the presence of all these companies, you can share a lot of buildings and facilities and so on. So all these MSMEs, as part of connecting with the GCs, they should also be clustered together. There are a lot of good synergies. And it is not a top-down strategy in China. These clusters came spontaneously out of all this. The moment we start connecting them with the global value chain, these clustering things happen automatically. It is not a top-down strategy.
Great. And I know that some of the points that you highlighted is what the government is also thinking along the lines, right, on those aspects, right? There is more, I like the cluster. I want to get to this question from Shweta, and this is overall sort of challenging situation that we are in, right? What could be done?
Okay. Now, that's a very, very interesting question. Now, you have good e-commerce models, but they have to be backed up with good logistics. So there are different e-commerce models. During the last 20 years, we have developed many different types of e-commerce models. Manufacturer storage with direct shipping, and manufacturer the last mile deliveries, and so different. There are 5 or 6 basic e-commerce models. Now, each of these different types of e-commerce models are supported by good logistics. You got to have the inventories in the right place. And give you one example. Now, increasingly people order online, right? Now, the net result is retail inventories have gone down drastically. For instance, if you were to go to a company like Best Buy in the United States, 2 or 3 years ago, you'll find lots of inventories at the retail level. But today, because everybody's ordering online, all these inventories are pulled back. Now, in supply chain, we call it logistics postponement. Now, that logistics postponement is a very important factor that is reshaping global supply chains, especially supply chains that are devoted to e-commerce. And now, by picking back the inventories, we suddenly discovered the pooling effect. The inventories reduced according to the square root law of distribution. And so, there's huge savings in inventory, and that savings is passed on to the customer. The only problem is the inventories are further upstream. Now, today, customers ordering online, they're willing to wait for 1 or 2 days for the product to come, but no longer everybody wants their product to come instantly. So now they're they're now working on last mile delivery business models and so forth. So the answer to that question is, so whatever e-commerce model that you develop, there is correspondingly an optimal logistics system that
YouTube channel,
otherwise the e-commerce model will not serve.
YouTube എടുത്തിട്ട് അതിനകത്ത് ഒരു ഇത് വരും, മണിയുടെ പടമുള്ള ഒരു ഇത് വരും. അതിൽ നോക്കിയാൽ ലിങ്ക് വരും. അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അടുക്കളയുടെ അവിടെ വന്നാൽ മതി.
Question is, how do we think about sustainability and certifications? All of this matters in the MSME world, right? I think there's access to a bunch of resources when it comes to large-scale enterprises. But if you are thinking about lean, how do we think?
I think that's what there's never occurred to me until I just heard this question. Now, in sustainability, sustainability involves lots of customer returns, recycling, remanufacturing, refurbishing, etc. Now, there's a huge need for organizing the reverse logistics. Now, the forward logistics, everything goes well, very streamlined fashion, the forward direction. The wrong direction of a one-way lane and a one-way road. The reverse logistics on the goods don't flow well at all. And so we need to think about much better ways of that. And that is exactly where the small companies can play a big factor. And so that is actually happening in big time in India. In India, like India and China, you will notice there are lots of small entrepreneurs who thrive on this newspaper collection, different recycling. There's a huge opportunity for the MSME sector in sustainability, especially reverse logistics activities. And I'm currently working on a hub and spoke model for reverse logistics, but it's going off on a tangent now. But basically, coming back to your point, in fact, it just occurred to me after I heard this question. The MSME sector can actually be can actually play a very important role in reverse logistics and sustainability activities.
Hey, so I know we have a little time here, and we have a lot of questions. I wish there is a way and to sort of get these questions to you, Dr. Suresh. Have your thoughts and inputs here. But in summary, I want to bring this question back from Dr. Goenka. What are the three most important steps, right, in summary, that the government of India needs to take?
Yes.
India is the first alternative, right, for manufacturing.
Yes. I think it's a great summary question. The three, I would say, first of all, we have set up a lot of SCCs, but we must also make them accountable. We must make them deliver in terms of foreign direct investments, in terms of job creation, etc. So the SCC sector must be utilized as a catalyst to stimulate manufacturing. That is a very important thing. And then domestically, the rest of the country, we have to do everything possible to stimulate manufacturing activity. We have to dismantle this permanent license called Raj. Use that word very often. His name was Rajagopalachari. He was the first Governor General of India. It was Rajaji who came up with this idea of permanent license called Raj. But if you go back to his writings, then his articles are extremely far-sighted. Many of the articles were written back in the 1960s or 70s. If you read those articles, they're extremely far-sighted. So in other words, coming back, what we have to do for the rest of the country is to dismantle permanent license for Raj. We have to make manufacturing much more easy. Only then more entrepreneurs will come to the manufacturing sector. And the third aspect is by stimulating manufacturing, you can really also have to become a technology leader. One of the takeaways from partnering with the foreign companies is also to learn from them the best practices, not only production technology, but also global marketing strategies.